Try to picture this. I'm standing in the middle of a harsh winter with no grocery store down the road, no fridge humming in the kitchen, and not even a freezer to fall back on. There are no shelves stacked with canned goods, no power lines feeding electricity into my home, and definitely no delivery truck showing up overnight. All I've got is whatever I'm able to hunt, gather, grow, or manage to preserve with my own two hands. For Native American communities, that wasn't some dramatic scenario you read in a book. It was everyday life. And the amazing part is they didn't just get by. They figured it out so well that survival became a skill they mastered. They came up with all kinds of clever ways to keep food from spoiling, stretching it out for weeks, months, and sometimes even years. They did it using nothing more than the natural world around them, a sharp eye, and a whole lot of know-how. In this story, I'm diving into those old preservation methods, everything from pemmican, which is basically the original survival superfood, to smart plant storage tricks, and even fermentation techniques that honestly hold their own against modern food science. And here's the thing I love most. These methods aren't dusty relics from the past. They're still useful, practical, sustainable approaches that can make our lives easier even now. It doesn't matter if you're living on a homestead, prepping for emergencies, or just trying to cut down on waste and reconnect with the rhythm of nature. Long before Europeans set foot on this continent, native communities lived in sync with the seasons. Summer and fall were times of plenty. There were fresh berries everywhere, huge herds of bison moving across the plains, and rivers packed with fish. But winter flipped the script. Food vanished under layers of snow, animals became scarce, and if a hunt didn't go well, the danger of going hungry became very real. For me, preservation feels like the thing that connected two completely different worlds. The times when food was everywhere and the times when it all seemed to vanish. It took those short bursts of abundance and stretched them into steady, year-round security. Because of that, people could plan ahead, trade with distant groups, travel freely, and even hold big gatherings or ceremonies during seasons when food normally would have been hard to come by. Preservation wasn't some optional skill either. It was a survival tool every bit as essential as knowing how to make a fire or build a shelter. One of the easiest and most widely used methods was turning fresh meat into jerky. Hunters would slice the meat into thin strips, trim off the fat so it wouldn't spoil, and hang the pieces on wooden racks to dry in the sun and the wind. In certain areas, they'd keep slow-burning fires going underneath, letting the smoke drift upward. That smoke didn't just add flavor. It helped keep bugs off the meat and slowed down anything that might cause it to rot. Jerky turned out to be incredibly sturdy, light to carry, and dependable. You could chew it dry as is, or toss it into a pot to soften it into a stew. For tribes that were constantly on the move, jerky changed everything. Instead of hauling around heavy chunks of fresh meat, they could travel with something lightweight, packed with protein, and stable enough to last for weeks. But jerky was really just the foundation. The true masterpiece of native food preservation was something called pemmican. The process started by drying meat completely, then crushing it down into a fine, almost powdery meal. Warm, melted fat was mixed in, sometimes with a handful of dried berries for flavor or nutrients, and the whole blend was pressed tightly into rawhide bags. What came out of that was a powerhouse of calories, a food that stayed good for years, not just weeks. It was light, packed with energy, and perfect for anyone who had to cover long distances. Hunters, travelers, warriors, you name it. European fur traders were so blown away by it that they started relying on pemmican during their own long treks across the continent. Before long, it became a major fuel source behind the entire North American fur trade. Even today, folks who focus on survival gear and prepping still look at pemmican as the top-tier, long-lasting trail food. And smoking meat wasn't only about giving it that rich flavor. It formed a kind of natural protective barrier. The smoke carried compounds, phenols, that slowed down bacterial growth while the heat pushed out moisture. In some communities, people would roast meat or fish first and then seal it under a layer of rendered fat, basically creating an airtight shield. I've learned that fish, especially salmon, played a huge role too. During those big seasonal runs, people would smoke and dry massive amounts of it on tall wooden racks, sometimes enough to carry an entire community through the winter. Along the coasts, some groups even stored meat completely submerged in seal or whale oil. That oil kept everything cool and cut off from oxygen, acting almost like a natural refrigerator long before anyone dreamed of plugging one into a wall. And of course, meat wasn't the only thing that needed to be saved for later. Corn, beans, and squash, what many folks know as the Three Sisters, were the backbone of countless native diets, and each one had its own reliable storage method. Corn might be dried right on the cob or shelled and tucked away in lined pits, sturdy baskets, or clay pots sealed with mud. Beans were dried until they snapped cleanly and then packed into woven sacks. Squash was sliced into rings, dried in the sun, and sometimes hung up like strings of decorations. Put together, these foods offered everything a body needed: carbs, protein, and vital vitamins that kept people going through those long stretches when fresh plants and fruits just weren't around. Foragers also treated the forest like a well-managed pantry. Berries were either sun-dried or mashed into thick cakes that stored easily. Nuts were cracked open and processed. Acorns, for example, were soaked to wash out their bitterness before being ground into flour. Underground roots and tubers, like camas, were slow-baked in earth ovens until they turned sweet and held up better in storage. Even wild herbs and greens were carefully dried to make sure folks still had access to those crucial micronutrients once winter settled in. And none of this was just random picking or hoping for the best. Everything had a schedule, tied closely to the natural rhythms of the land so that no resource was ever pushed past its limit. And fermentation, that wasn't luck either, it was intentional. Some tribes fermented corn into foods similar to hominy, while others let certain berries naturally ferment into mild alcoholic drinks that stayed good longer and offered a few bonus calories. Fermented fish and meat, even though the smell could be a little intense, were incredibly nutritious and easier for the body to digest. In the freezing months, when every calorie mattered, that kind of food was priceless. What's wild is that all of this relied on beneficial microbes doing their thing, long before anyone understood the science behind it. I've come to see that food preservation, for many native communities, wasn't something done alone in a quiet corner. It was a full-on community effort. When the salmon came rushing in, whole villages would gather to gut, smoke, and dry the fish together. After a bison hunt, people worked side by side slicing meat, melting down fat, stretching hides, and making sure nothing went to waste. Everybody had a job to do, and all that shared work turned what could have felt like a desperate chore into something closer to a celebration. Songs filled the air, stories were passed around, and rituals were woven into the process, turning food preservation into a cultural and spiritual foundation that held people together. And the thing is, these old methods aren't locked away in the past. They're practical tools we can pick up today. Drying, smoking, fermenting, sealing foods in fat, these are all skills anyone can learn, and they can cut down on waste, keep grocery bills lower, and build a sense of independence that's honestly pretty empowering. They're also the kind of skills that come in handy when life throws surprises our way. Whether it's a power outage, a supply chain issue, or just a weekend out camping, knowing how to keep food safe without a fridge makes everything a whole lot easier. More than anything, these practices remind us to move with the seasons, to plan ahead, appreciate abundance while it's here, and share what we have. Food preservation wasn't only about technique. It carried meaning. Many tribes offered thanks before storing food, leaving a symbolic portion for the earth or for the spirits. That simple act reaffirmed the idea that survival wasn't about dominating the land. It was about working in harmony with it. Honestly, that mindset might be the biggest lesson we can carry forward today. With climate change and environmental challenges staring us down, reconnecting with that kind of respect could help us shape a more sustainable future for how we grow, gather, and preserve our food. So that's the heart of it, the brilliant preservation strategies that helped Native Americans not just survive, but truly thrive in some of the toughest environments on the planet. I'm curious, which method grabbed your attention the most? Was it pemmican, those oil-sealed meats, or maybe the different ways plants were dried and stored? Let me know. I'd honestly love to hear which one you'd be willing to try in your own kitchen. And if this gave you a new appreciation for the depth of ancestral knowledge, feel free to like the video, share it with someone who's into history or survival skills, and subscribe for more deep dives into the wisdom that got our ancestors through the hardest of times. And hey, if you want to take this a step further, try one of these techniques yourself. Dry a batch of fruit, put together a small homemade smoker, or look up the traditional food storage methods from your own region. Because every time we bring these old ways back to life, we're not just saving food, we're keeping a piece of our shared human story alive.